Good evening. Thank you so much for coming tonight to the first Potent Residence reading event of the spring semester. My name is Lauren Elaine, and for those of you who haven't been here before, I'm the Potent Residence here at UD, and a big part of that position is to host this series, which is an opportunity to bring contemporary writers to our campus and to our community. Here, if you're in our department, or actually if you're a student at UD, you sort of have to study literature. Everybody takes 112. And, we engage with texts on the page, and we write papers. And, I certainly try, and I think my colleagues do too, to teach literature and the work that we encounter as conversations from a you to an I, or from an I to a you, however you want to posit that, to sort of understand that writing is in some sense a dialogue as well as an invitation. It's also art. It's an opportunity to experience the word, not just as something to be cracked open and analyzed. Billy Collins has this awesome poem called Introduction to Poetry, where he says, I try to tell the students, have fun with the poem, listen to the poem, ski on the surface of the poem, and all they want to do is tie it to a chair and beat it with a hose until it fesses up what it means. And, it sounds familiar, right? It sounds like a paper. I'm here to say that our reading series is an opportunity to put the hose down, sit back, relax, enjoy. Again, Billy Collins in an essay talks about to read the poem, you're in control. When you're reading, you're in control. When you're being read to, you have to let go of the reins and have somebody else dictate what you get, what you don't get. You can't flip back, you can't say rewind, you just have to go with it. So hopefully this is an opportunity to be immersed in, to absorb, to be inspired, confounded, and ideally somehow, however small, altered and changed by. Tonight is particularly special. At the end of the event, we'll be inducting somewhere between 8 and 11 members to Sigma Tau Delta, which is the English Honor Society, whose mission we'll hear about later. This is going to be a very short addition to the ceremonies, so we ask that you stick around after the Q&A and welcome the new members with us, and then eat the lovely spread they've so wonderfully provided. So to introduce tonight's guest, tonight's reader, Tim Bascom is the author of the novel Squatters' Rites, a collection of essays, The Comfort Trap, and the prize-winning memoir, Chameleon Days, An American Boyhood in Ethiopia. His essays, stories, and poems have been published in numerous literary journals. His work has been selected for the Best Creative Nonfiction and Best American Travel Writing. In addition, he writes features and personal experience pieces for all sorts of journals, such as the Des Moines City Magazine, Dynasty In-Flight Magazine, which is the China Airlines travel magazine. You gotta tell me about that sometime. Kansas City Star, Christian Science Monitor, Modern Bride, lots of cool places that he writes these personal interest pieces for. He's currently the director of creative writing at Waldorf College here in Iowa. And before that, he was what he called at lunch an academic nomad, teaching creative writing at a variety of different institutions, including Drake University, DMAC, the University of Missouri. Before that, and tell me if I have the chronology right, he traveled to over 25 countries while working for a nonprofit that provided training for writers and editors in Africa and Asia. So he's been around, and we are very lucky tonight that he landed in Dubuque, Iowa, in our Couchman Reading Room. Tonight, he's going to read from his newest work, which is a coming-of-age memoir entitled Running to the Fire, and was published last April by the University of Iowa Press. It's about his experience as the son of missionaries stationed in Ethiopia during the Marxist Revolution there. And that's all I'll say about that. But I do want to say that as a writer, I've really admired Tim's movement between simplicity and complexity, right? Especially around the idea of experience and the way in his writing he negotiates time, faith, belonging, all of that big stuff, while sort of really rooting it in this familiar and yet wonderfully riveting story of what it means to grow up and to grow into oneself. So I will let you experience that now, and welcome with me Tim Bascom.
Thanks for that very warm welcome, Lauren. And thanks to the English department. I enjoyed getting to meet a few people, John and Michelle and Janine. Glad to be with you all on a special occasion. Glad to hear that some people like English and are going to be inducted into this society together. Lauren, by the way, is a terrific poet. If you haven't read Difficult Fruit, you need to get your hands on it and read that collection. I enjoyed it very much. I have a friend from South Sudan who also received a very warm welcome in Dubuque. He studied here at Wartburg Seminary and talked often of it. I got to spend time with him in South Sudan a couple of years ago. And I'm just being reminded of a rather odd thing that he recalled while we were talking, but he said he had a terrible time in Chicago when he first came in because no one would tell him where to find the bus for Dubuque. He kept asking, where is the bus to Dubuque? Total difficulty. So I like to get to know my audience a little bit, so I'm going to do a survey of you to start with on this occasion. Anyone here traveled out of the United States? Hands in the air. Wow! Yeah, it's all right, Tingle. We're going to get along okay. This is good. All over the place, I would assume. Somebody shout out a place. There were hands there.
Australia.
Where? Mexico. I heard Canada, Spain, Europe. Uruguay. Nice. I like this. Any preacher kids out there? Oh, okay. So I'm in good company. Any missionary kids by chance? Somebody who spent time growing up with mission family?
My dad was a missionary kid.
Over here?
My dad.
Where?
Papua New Guinea.
Papua New Guinea. Interesting. Anyone who has read at least 3 books of the Bible? Again, got some correspondence going on here. Anyone from Kansas? Not a single Kansan in the room? Okay. Anyone from a small town in the Midwest? Okay, good, good. Any middle children? We know what it's like, don't we? It's a hard place to be. Middle kid. Ignored totally. Anyone with parents who seem a little driven? Anybody? Okay, good. Any writers? Anybody here who likes to write? Tends to do it every once in a while. Anybody who is an introvert who doesn't like to raise a hand in a group setting like Okay, I think we're going to be all right. I think we're going to understand each other. So I was a shy, introverted middle kid with very driven religious parents who lived half of my childhood in a small town in Kansas and half of it in Ethiopia, where my parents went to work as missionaries. And my parents brought us back from Ethiopia the first time when I was 9 years old, and we went to this little town in Kansas, Troy, Kansas. Unfortunately, none of you know where it is, probably because you're not Kansans. But we spent 6 years there, and for 6 years I tried really hard to just be an American kid, because it's not cool to be from Africa in that setting. At least that's the way I experienced it when I was that age. And so I had kind of a hard-earned sense of putting down roots and becoming that American kid when my father called us into the living room and asked us as a family would we be willing to go back to Ethiopia. And that was a kind of shocking moment when I was a sophomore in high school. I'm going to ask, does anybody remember who Haile Selassie is? Got a couple people. Emperor of Ethiopia, one of the last emperors to exist. We had the Shah, he was an emperor over in Iran. We had Selassie, maybe a few others who've tried since. Bokassa over there in Central African Empire for a while was trying to be an emperor. He had a gold chariot and everything. He was overthrown in 1974 while we were in Troy, Kansas. We had lived there earlier under his reign as the emperor of Ethiopia. Nobody was very concerned about him having been overthrown. 1974, anybody remember what was happening in the United States at that time? Watergate. So we had our own emperor who was being overthrown. And people were more interested in what was happening to Nixon And it was just kind of small news in the bottom of the newspaper every once in a while about occurrences overseas in Ethiopia. But for us, that mattered a lot. Haile Selassie was very revered by people across Africa, actually. He'd helped start the Organization for African Unity, the OAU, and its headquarters are still in Ethiopia. He had brought in the first airline in Africa. He had banned slavery, which, believe it or not, was still happening in his country and was happening in other countries during the 40s and 50s. He had done a number of things, and he had forecast kind of World War II. A lot of Europeans looked to him as somebody who had a prescient sense of what was coming when he spoke to world leaders. And Italy had invaded Ethiopia, and he said, it's coming, it's going to be much larger, and it's going to affect everybody. But he was overthrown by a popular communist revolution. And I'm just going to jump in here at the front of the book. When I'm a sophomore and my parents have started to have this kind of conversation and I'm feeling it around me, a year passed and my parents' attention kept turning more toward Ethiopia, renewed in a strangely insistent way. As we shifted into the summer of 1975, I steeled myself for high school by working in the hayfields, getting thinner and tougher from swinging bales onto a flatbed trailer. I started feeling more aggressive in a new, unfamiliar way, more restless and opinionated, more interested in girls as well. When I hoisted myself out of the pool and pattered down the concrete in my dripping swimsuit, I couldn't help being drawn to the wonderfully tanned girl at the concession counter who kept pivoting in her yellow bikini, bobbing to the music as she took orders. I gave her a quarter and grinned as she mixed up a suicide, blonde hair swaying while she shifted from the Coke dispenser to the Dr. Pepper and root beer. I could hear Bachman Turner Overdrive belting out, "You ain't seen nothing yet," and it was all exciting in a new male way. To be 14, going on 15, to feel that anything was possible, and to be here in small-town America with a personal connection to a huge panoramic cause on the other side of the globe. In Ethiopia, rebel soldiers had rounded up all parliamentary representatives and civil servants, labeling them enemies of the revolution. Then they had dragged 57 of these prominent leaders out of the basement of the Palace of Menelik, transporting them to the main prison and machine gunning them as they stepped from the trucks. The newspapers were suggesting that the shadowy new leaders might be in league with our arch enemies, the Soviets. Mom and Dad were hearing reports of Christians being singled out, told to recant or suffer the consequences. They said an Ethiopian doctor at one of the mission hospitals had been forced to walk to jail nearly naked and barefoot, with men shooting rifles into the air. Why? Simply because he was associated with Americans and their foreign religion. As the lead singer for Bachman Turner Overdrive stuttered out his signature baby, I was struck that somewhere right now there might be people I had actually touched who were in prison for what they believed. I knew I should be grieving like my parents, but in all honesty, I found it exciting. There was a strange appeal to the situation, the allure of being part of something bigger than myself, something meaningful, like the huge novel by Alexander Dumas, which I had been reading that summer. Over there in Ethiopia, real people were living lives just as dramatic as Dante in The Count of Monte Cristo, being imprisoned wrongfully and hoping to escape, to get revenge, or at least see that God balanced the equation. And to my surprise, that seemed inviting. So this book, when it was first written, was just kind of like a novel, and I wrote it in that fashion, just telling the story of that teen and what he went through back in the 70s during that one intense year in Ethiopia. But when I gave it to the editors who showed interest at the University of Iowa Press, they said it's not a memoir, which I still take issue with somewhat because I think memoirs can be written in a novelistic fashion. But they were pushing me saying, who is the older self who is remembering all of this? And what does that person think of what occurred? What can that person provide in terms of cultural context or history? What can that person say personally about actually what's felt around the issues that are coming up in the story? And I felt forced into starting to write another layer into the book, 100 pages eventually, that was inserted in as opposing chapters so that you alternate between the younger self and the older self back and forth throughout. And at first I didn't want to do that, but as I did it, I started realizing this is actually what I need to do, and it's what I wanted to do, but I was afraid to do it. I was afraid because I knew that self was going to have to say some things that my own parents were not going to be happy with, that my people who I had known growing up, my tribe, were not going to necessarily agree with at times. I'll give you the very next chapter to give you a taste of that. I'm back again, the intrusive older guy. Yes, missionaries are driven by a desire to spread their faith. However, they are also driven to have adventure. Although they may not admit it, many of them have an instinctive attraction to danger, a desire to live life in a large, risky way, going beyond where others would stop. The most famous missionary associated with Africa, Dr. David Livingstone, became well known in the 1850s when he did what no white man had done before, walking his way clear across southern Africa, where he eventually discovered the great Zambezi Falls of Mosi Ottuna, smoke that thunders, on the border of present-day Zimbabwe. Having been hailed by the Royal Geographic Society, he left the employ of the London Missionary Society to lead a subsequent expedition searching for the source of the Nile. He felt sure that such exploration fit into his missionary mandate, since it would open the Nile to river traffic, which would allow for the spread of Christianity and hopefully force an end to the ruthless Arab slave trade. Although Livingstone never did identify the head of the Nile, despite wandering off the known map for 6 years, he did explore the Great Lakes of Tanganyika and Malawi and Bangweulu. And when he died, debilitated by malaria and dysentery, he was 1,000 miles from the port where he began. According to legend, his body was found kneeling by his cot in a praying posture, and the local tribe would not allow his porters to carry the corpse away until they had removed the heart, insisting, "You can have his body, but his heart belongs to Africa." That was in 1873, and only 20 years later, the founder of my parents' mission, Roland Bingham, started his own exploratory journeys, no doubt very aware of Livingstone, whose remains were carried to the coast of Zanzibar before being shipped to Britain for burial at Westminster Abbey. Bingham, a British-born Canadian, made a very Livingstonian proclamation: "I will open Africa to the gospel or die trying." And though he didn't end up dying, he got awfully close. Starting from the coast of present-day Nigeria, he hiked into the vast interior, turning back only when one companion died of malaria and another succumbed after a period of captivity. On a second attempt, Bingham himself nearly died from malaria. It was only when he had recruited 4 new missionaries from Canada that he was able to establish the first station of the Sudan Interior Mission, 400 miles inland, where yet another recruit died and 2 had to return home broken by illness. Still, Bingham lived on, directing the growing mission through World War I, eventually handing on the pioneering baton to hundreds of inspired recruits, including an American named Malcolm Forsberg, who in 1934 rode a mule several hundred miles into the southernmost mountains of Ethiopia, living in a thatched hut until he could marry his fiancée and bring her to join him. And it was this intrepid couple, perhaps the first white foreigners to see whole valleys and mountainsides of an unreached region, who trained my parents at Mission Candidate School in New York City in 1964. Malcolm and Enid Forsberg were cheerful, enthusiastic retirees by the time my parents met them, yet they were still raising the flag, so to speak, and sending new recruits right back into the fire, despite having been forced out of Ethiopia by the Italian occupation and having left neighboring Sudan due to a civil war, which is to say that my parents came by their risk-taking, exploratory hankering in an honest way, even if they themselves didn't recognize how much it motivated them. By joining Sudan Interior Mission in the 1960s, they became part of a religious geographic society, not unlike the Royal Geographic Society, determined to reach the ends of the earth, but for different reasons. A pioneer-like love of adventure went naturally with their sense of mission. They had something large to accomplish, and since they felt called by God, anything they attempted would be worth the risk. This, of course, is the exact mentality necessary for serious expeditionary work, the willingness to risk death for the sake of something more important. Paradoxically, the one who commits to such ventures tends to think that risking death is worth the stress because out there, on the verge of annihilation, is where life might be found. Hadn't Jesus himself said, "The man who loves his life will lose it, while the man who hates his life in this world will keep it for eternal life"? So I've often had people ask, why would your parents, of all things, decide to take you into Ethiopia right in the middle of the Marxist Revolution? There's the answer, is that this is the way they were thinking. And they had this sense that if we went, God would take care of us, because after all, we were in the middle of God's will, so there was nothing to worry about. And off we went. I'll read you one more portion, and then we can talk a little bit if you'd like. This gives you just a taste of what it was like once we arrived in Ethiopia. And I was immediately sent to a boarding school, along with my younger brother, Nat. Our older brother was still in the States. And that boarding school only went through 8th grade, so I would have to travel across the city to another school each day. We'd have to go through checkpoints regularly because there were ones set up every few miles throughout the city. And at times that could get very hairy. I'm just going to read a portion from one day when we had to go from the school to the mission headquarters for SIM for a church service. And I got onto the bus, and actually I was very concerned about a certain girl named Mary, who I was wanting to sit next to. She didn't want to sit next to me. She said she was saving the seat for Donnie. And as a result, I had to go to the back of the bus. And I sat down there, and I was kind of resentful, and I was staring out the back window, feeling bad for myself. The city was on high alert, and that's because just then Mengistu had executed 7 from the Derg, the Committee of Equals. Colonel Mengistu was the leader of the Derg, and he was more equal than the rest, so he would do things like this. And there was kind of this culture of fear that came down from the top. So the city was on high alert, stationing more soldiers on the streets than ever. Here was another patrolling jeep, which should have made me extra cautious as I looked out the back window. However, I was too upset by the recent rejection to really think. I stared at the soldier who was standing in the rear of the vehicle, clamping the handles of the swiveling machine gun. He was not much older than me. I noticed the dirt on the lenses of his goggles and the bulging red cloth he had tied over his hair. I decided he looked foolish with his bug-like eyes and the barrel of his gun poking forward like the proboscis of an insect. I kept staring at him, with no thought for how my gaze might be interpreted, until the driver of the Jeep suddenly pointed at me and shouted over his shoulder. Then the gun barrel came up, aimed at my chest, and with a snarl, the gunner began to jerk as if riding a jackhammer. I fell to the floor, heart hammering. When I peered down at my torso, I expected a row of bloody holes. So I was confused to find myself intact. Was I hallucinating? Still terrified, I dared to peek back through the little window at the bottom of the rear door, and I saw the goggled gunner slapping at the helmet of the driver, grinning wildly. His teeth were bright white. He swung the gun toward me again and vibrated, roaring at his own joke. This time, since my adrenaline had worn off, I nearly fainted. The strange thing is that still, no one had noticed what was happening, as they were closer to the front and faced forward. When I climbed back onto the rear seat of the bus, I felt more alone than ever, hunched over with my undisclosed terror. I fixed my eyes on the floor, clammy, nauseated. I was still in that state when we arrived at the mission headquarters. As I got off the bus with dusk settling over the city, it seemed as if I had come unmoored from my body like a helium balloon rising over my head. Although my classmates were right in front of me, goofing around while they filed into the chapel, I felt completely removed. I didn't realize until 10 minutes into the service, after we had sung an opening hymn, that my father was actually going to be the guest speaker. The usual minister, a choleric, red-faced man with a shock of silver hair, explained that Dr. Bascom had just returned from a special medical mission in southern Ethiopia, so we would hear from him rather than receiving a homily. Apparently, Dad had taken several days to travel south, far past our old stations at Lamo and Sodu, eventually reaching the dusty savanna town of Arba Minch, alongside a lake in the Rift Valley. He had gone to offer a mobile clinic, which meant taking a visiting lady doctor with him, plus a translator. As it turned out, he had asked our old friend, Solly Tillahun, to be the translator, since Solly had lost his job as a school principal after being jailed briefly for spreading subversive ideas, in essence, handing out gospel tracts. Solly had come to this service along with Dad to help with the sermon, so he joined my father at the pulpit. With his soft, shy smile, he seemed the antithesis of someone who might be picked out by communist cadres as a threat. Maybe it was because he refused to take anything too seriously. He seemed to see humor everywhere, laughing at any absurdity, whether the cruel twists of fate brought on by the revolution or the zany hijinks of my father when a fan belt broke on their Land Rover. Solly was not translating well for a while, Dad explained while patting him on the shoulder, because he wouldn't stop laughing as I made a substitute fan belt out of Dr. Dina's leather belt and a roll of duct tape. And when that broke, which forced me to improvise with shoestrings, we thought we were going to have to give him CPR. Quickly assuming his role as the straight man, Solly broke in. Well, to be honest, it was very much dangerous to my health, I think, traveling with this man. I might say it could be more dangerous than any Kabyle checkpoint. People actually clapped, released for a moment from all the worries. A joke, even better, a joke about checkpoints. So the two men went on with their unorthodox approach, making so many comic asides that before long the whole church was rollicking right back to the rows where the senior high usually kept their sleepy silence. Dad explained that when his little medical team was still far from at us, out in the sandy acacia forest, the shoestring fan belt snapped, so they had to stop in the shade next to a giant anthill and try to come up with a new option. While waiting, Solly fell into conversation with a cluster of people who had stepped out of the bushes. All the women had long sticks tied to their grass skirts, and when Dad asked about the sticks, Solly explained that these left trails in the dirt. And that was how each man could find his wife. Go ahead, tell them how the men knew which trail went with which woman. Ah, Bates, said Solly, looking sternly at my father, I do not think they'll let us back in this church. No, it's fine, I'm church. All right then. The stick was moving just with the woman's body, like this, he added. And he stepped from behind the pulpit to sway his hips. The students loved this stuff. Here was a sermon like none they had heard before, broken fan belts, hip-waggling trails. The whole section around me began laughing. Next to my father, who was never one to waste an opportunity for evangelism, and this is very creative on his part, explained how he and Solly had found a biblical parallel for this stick-in-the-dust accessory, telling the gathered crowd that each person left a trail that was distinct, and only God knew these trails, which meant God could come and find us if we got lost. It's true, Solly added, letting his shy smile peek through. I can say for sure, God knows just the way we walk. Apparently, the only repair option that was left out there in the acacia forest was to replace the broken fan belt with the visiting doctor's pantyhose, which she graciously offered. To their amazement, the hose lasted another half an hour. I'm assuming it was due to prayer, my father said, because there was a lot of prayer around those pantyhose. Probably more prayer than any pantyhose has ever gotten. In any case, when they finally neared the checkpoint close to Shashamane, with the substitute belt shredded and the brakes going soft, my father had to bring the vehicle down into third gear and second, grinding finally into first, so that he would not roll past the point where a sentry was manning a gun. Solly jumped out to put a rock behind the wheel, which caused all the other sentries to swing their rifles off their straps. They were not amused, and after one of them discovered a bundle of Amharic gospel tracts in the trunk, their lieutenant shook the pamphlets in the air, snarling, "This is poison, the drug of America. Don't you know there is no God?" Instead of staying silent, my father blurted out, "So how did all of this come into being? That thorn bush, that bird, you, me?" "It was not God, so it just happened. It was not God." "Can you believe it?" Solly interjected. "Uncle Charlie, that's what I call him, just threw down a tool from the back of the car, and he asked that soldier, 'How did it get there? Did it decide for itself?'" The listeners at the chapel in Ada smiled warmly, seeing how Dad was challenging the Marxist notion of chance origins behind the universe. Solly was on a roll as he continued. "It was beautiful, I'm telling you, just the way he asked them to explain. How did the tool get there? I could see they did not know what to say. Their dialectical materialism is good only for the classroom. It does not explain who made the tool or who moved it. It does not explain how the world began." I was still in shock somewhat from the near-death experience on the bus, but I was heartened by the bold way my father and Solly were talking up there at the front of the church. I was warmed, too, by their amused smiles. I wanted to be as brave. God called for courage, assuring us that he had counted the hairs on our heads, that he even knew when a sparrow fell. Surely then, God had seen what took place on the bus earlier, had been there watching, ready to intervene if necessary. Although I hardly got a chance to hug my father after the service, on the way back to the academy in the dark, I relished the admiring comments that came from his unconventional sermon. This time I was sitting with my brother Nat and his friend Paul, feeling more like a part of the group. "Cool sermon," Paul said, and Dan Coleman chipped in from a seat behind me. "Man, your dad is a total weed," which I took to be positive. I grinned, conscious that it was now past 8:30 p.m. and quite dark, conscious too that if we were not back through the Bingham Gate within an hour, we would be out illegally. For a moment, I could see the bug-eyed soldier with a red bandana snarling as he swung the mounted gun toward me. Being out after curfew was no joke, but if it had to happen for some reason, we would be okay. I must trust. After all, the same God that my father had defended from the pulpit was the creator of the universe, the one with the master plan. This God was in charge of all the laws of nature, so that a pair of pliers would clank down properly if tossed into the air, and the moon would swoop around the earth in a faithful circle. With such strength on my side, surely I had nothing to fear. Thank you. So those are just a couple of snippets. And I'm glad to talk if you want to talk. Does anybody have a question or rebuttal? Yeah.
There's a lot of information just in what you've read to us. So how, when writing that, did you decide what was pertinent, what was to be left out?
Good question. Writing nonfiction is interesting for me. I've been thinking about the creative side of it. We call it creative nonfiction. Well, why is it creative, or how is it creative? And fiction, to me, seems more like you create from ex nihilo. It's not really true because you draw on a lot of your own experience, but you can take it any way you want. I like to sculpt, and if you put together an armature of wire and you put clay on it, you can just build on it. It's very plastic. You can move it as you wish. creative nonfiction is actually more like stone sculpting in the sense that you have this big block of experience and you walk up to it and you look at it and like, what the heck? What's in there, you know? And so a lot of the creativity, I think, is in excising and getting rid of what's not pertinent. And I don't know that there's like a single rule, but you have to have some thematic drive that's pulling you through. In my case, early on, I started realizing that it was strange that that year that was so traumatic was one of the best years of my life. So I was trying to understand that. I wasn't entirely proud of it even, because I'm not sure that I should be claiming that, but the truth was that's what it was for me. So that's pulling me through the story, and things that aren't pertinent to that maybe have to go. But having said that, there's a lot that I don't know, and that eventually I start adding. So I guess it's not entirely about excising. I did a lot of research, actually. You know, I knew about Livingston roughly, but I wanted to know more, so I had to read about his life and figure out what are the parallels here? Why were the Marxists so critical of him, which they were? And I was embarrassed by that as a graduate student when I was going through my first degree at University of Kansas, and a lot of my professors were trained in Marxist thought and were taking a Marxist critical approach to everything we read. And didn't know until it would come up that my parents had been missionaries in Africa, which put me in an odd place. But I was trying to think through that kind of thing, and that was, again, a kind of submission within what I was writing to make sense of the conflict between Marxism and Christianity. And so I'm going to need to find some more stuff in some cases that will help me express what I'm learning. And I say what I'm learning, not what I know, because I tried to write it as honestly as I could. When I began, I even was willing to say this was all a mistake. My parents should never have been there. And I still wonder at times about that challenge, in part because of a reviewer on my earlier book that made me want to tease it out, think about it. Yeah. I don't know if I'm answering your question, but those are some decisions, yeah.
But that totally leads me to another question.
Yeah.
Is that right? So then when you're looking into all this information and you've already got the bones of what you want, you brought it to the editors and said, this is the story, and they asked you to add in the older man's perspective. How did you fit all that information into your story chronologically without making it seem like put on?
Good question. You need to read the book and write to me and let me know if it works. Because I still wonder at times, you know, does it work? People have tended to respond well, from what I can tell, and have tended to even say that in some cases they enjoy the older self more than they do the younger one. So that's been very satisfying to me. I did it in a way that I felt was a little bit, I don't want to say clumsy, but very heavy-handed a little bit, because I don't feel as adept at interweaving as some of the memoir writers I admire. And I already had this intact manuscript. So I took this route that I would just start flopping back and forth and have a dialogue all the way through. And I had to, as I wrote it, think about kind of intuitive connections, associative leaps that I would make between this material that I just gave you in my child or youth experience and now what I'm experiencing as the adult looking back. And those sometimes fell flat, and a reader would say, I don't understand that. My wife, being one of those readers, would say, why are you jumping there? Then I'd have to rethink it. And I laid it out on a table in a big circle and walked around, and I would actually take chapters and lift them out and go over here and put them down here. And then I'd have to think how to tool it so that it felt like it naturally led into that older self and then back out again into the teen experience. Yeah.
Earlier in your introduction, you had referred to yourself in the young person version of the part of the story as third person. I'm wondering, do you look at him as a different character at this point? Is that part of what helped get that dialogue between the older self and the younger self?
I keep the first person all the way through, but I do think I've learned to kind of distance that that's somebody else. That's the Tim I was. And I think all of us are like that. We're all changing, and that we once were somebody else, if not a bunch of people, right? And so I've talked with other memoir writers about this, but there will always be some dialogue between at least two points of view in a good memoir. Some people like to use the term song of innocence and the song of experience, like we have with William Blake. That's going on in the memoir, where the innocent self is just experiencing things, not knowing what they mean necessarily, and we want to feel the vivid experience of just being in that, kind of cinematic while it's happening. But we also want somebody who's more experienced now able to look back and say, here's what that apparently meant. And that's why we write memoir, is to make sense of the chaos that we experienced. And it's full of lies to some extent because it was chaotic. And here I'm giving you a organized look at it with a agenda that's inescapable. Even if it's just the agenda of telling a story, it's inescapably an agenda because I'm changing things to create that story arc that we talk about with rising tension and climax and that kind of thing. Because life, it has those moments, but not all the time. They're a mess. Yeah.
I'm curious, you had the young Tim memoir, and then you added this other stuff in. Did voicing the older perspective ever make you do major rewrites of the younger perspective?
Of the younger? I wouldn't say major. It did change parts of it that I found I had to add, and some in places delete. Had I been able to interweave it a little bit more, or had I been more psychically willing to do that earlier on, then maybe I wouldn't have even needed to do what I was doing at the end. If any of you read Tobias Wolff's memoir, This Boy's Life, beautiful book, well worth reading, and for me that had been kind of a Bible in the memoir sense to read through and see how he did it. And when I first read it, I was just taken by the youthful experience of this child going through life. But it was at a conference when somebody kind of challenged me on my perception that this was told so beautifully from a youth's point of view that I started to re-look at it. And I recommend to you rereading books. But going back through it, I just highlighted everything that was coming from more of an adult perspective in a book that had felt very like it was in this youthful voice. And I could not believe the amount of deftly inserted point of view that was coming in from that adult perspective. Yeah.
First, I haven't read your book. I apologize. I actually just heard of this event today. I'm not a student, so
Yeah.
I miss academia. But I was thinking, and when I saw Marxist on the ad or whatever, I was like, that's where I need to be tonight. And I'm wondering, so we have this macro lens of like, the conflict going on between, different political and religious ideologies, but I'm wondering if that macro lens ever influenced you personally. So were you ever challenged with your beliefs to go either way, like towards kind of that Marxist ideology or towards kind of your parents' missionary values?
Yeah. Well, the book is very much that exploration. If you were to read all the way through, you would find me going ahead and becoming more receptive to Marxist thought and also looking for commonalities between that thought and Christianity, because there are overlaps, though they've often been pitted against each other. So yes, over time that has changed a lot. And my capacity to maintain faith has changed a lot as well. As a child even, I think I was wired to doubt more than my brothers or my parents. I've wondered about that even genetically, people's capacity for faith, and I write about it in the book. I don't know that it was an accident that when I was only 3 or 4, I was nicknamed Puddleglum. Not everybody would be nicknamed that, or Eeyore, which also got thrown at me. that speaks to kind of my nature even at that early age, and it's a doubting nature. It's a defeatist kind of, things are too large sort of nature. I'm not happy with it necessarily, but it's the way I'm wired somewhat. And so the writing itself for me is wonderful because it's an exploration into understanding things. And my theory is that if people honestly write in the essayistic fashion, completely with that honesty, they will have epiphanies, they'll have discoveries. And if they get surprised, like if you get surprised while you're writing something, then the reader will be surprised. But if you already have your thesis, and nothing against scholarship because it has to work that way more, but it's like here's the target, pull it back, arrows pointed, and you know from the very beginning kind of where you're headed. That's probably not fair because I think the researcher through the research has done an exploration too, but often in the producing of the scholarly piece is trying to demonstrate the deft aim of that arrow. And the essay is called an attempt, a try. And this memoir is written in a more of an essayistic fashion now than it was originally. It's my attempt, my try at trying to make sense of a lot of things over time.
Hi.
Hi.
I have a question. In what I've heard of your writing, you explore your child self and your adult self, and in the context of Marxism and Christianity. In your work, do you explore the cultural, if there was any cultural friction between Christianity and the Ethiopian culture? That doesn't really focus on Marxism?
Yeah. The book gets into that as well somewhat. Ethiopia is very unique in Africa because it has this amazing history of Christianity already existing there from 400 AD, and in the form of Orthodox Christianity, more in the stream of Greek Orthodox or Russian Orthodox. So like when I walked into the library here, I immediately noticed they had all these icons, and I was like, oh, I got to go see if they have Ethiopian icons, because in fact, there's this rich tradition of Ethiopian icons that were painted in the 1000s, 1100s, 1200s in Ethiopia. In fact, there were Venetian painters who came over to Ethiopia to start, what do they call them, scriptoriums, or an area where they could work on making sacred scriptures and doing illuminations on them. And I've written about this actually for the Ethiopian Airlines magazine, the artwork of the Orthodox Church in Ethiopia. So I get into that a bit. Weirdly, well, not weirdly, I mean, it makes a lot of sense. When the missionaries came in, Ethiopia was a little bit split between north and south, and the northern area was more the fortress area kind of the Orthodox Church. And the emperor knew he had a real problem here. These missionaries were coming in saying, we have something for you. It's called Christianity, And these Orthodox believers were like, wait a minute. We've been kind of trying to do that for about, I don't know, 1,400 years, something like that. When did you guys start over there in the United States, So he said, the emperor, you can study language if you want, because Amharic is the national language in the north, and that's kind of the purest Amharic. You can go into the region, but you cannot proselytize. You can work in the south, which is more animistic religions and traditional religions. That's fine. And so there was this kind of interesting interaction. But there was tension from the beginning between the Orthodox Church and these evangelical missionaries who came in saying, we've got something that you need to have. Because obviously they had been pretty trained already. Yeah.
When you introduced the older self into the book, what sort of personal conflicts came in that you had?
Oh, don't do that to me. No. Yeah, I got into them just a tiny bit, not a lot. Personal conflicts. When I read the Bible now, And my wife is an Episcopal priest, so I married into the church again. I said I'd never do that, but we talk about these things. I have a hard time reading the Apostle Paul. He just kind of bothers me. And he seems arrogant. He was trained as a rhetorician, I would say, in the earliest sense. But his rhetoric, to me, feels kind of like tail chasing at times. And who am I to say this, given who he was and what he accomplished, which I still have admiration for. But it pains my mother to hear me talk that way, and I would never talk that directly if she was in the room. But I do in the book, so she does know, and she has written me letters in response, because she prizes what Paul represents and what, he was the first true missionary, and I write about him in the book, logging up 10,000 miles. People have come up with that figure, roughly, doing what he considered the important first missionary work in the church. So that's one of the toughest things, is me not being fully receptive in the more literal biblical tradition that I was raised in. Yeah. And there are others. In the earlier book, it was more about boarding school and the damage is done when parents decide that their cause, the will of God, trumps anything else, including their children. So being sent off to boarding school felt like an abandonment, and it was from two people who were loving and caring, so it was even harder. We've worked through all of that in a way that I think is pretty good, but I have friends who will always be damaged. I don't think they'll ever be recovered, so to speak, from the damage that occurred because of that dynamic within mission circles. Yeah, so those are the kinds of things.
I was actually asking more about your own internal conflict between your old self and your young self.
Internal conflict between who I am now and that guy?
Yeah, when you were writing, what sort of...
Well, he seems stupid at times. But I don't know. Over time, I've started to forgive him a little bit more for being stupid because he was that age. And, I don't know. I'm not sure if I have fully thought through that, how much that's there. Do you experience it?
Oh, yeah.
Between that older and younger self?
I was a Baptist missionary for 2 years when I was 22.
What's that?
I was a Baptist missionary when I was 22 for 2 years.
And so you look back wondering a little bit, why did I do what I did? Yeah. I was explaining to Lauren, she's taken a look at this book that she mentioned, The Comfort Trap, which came out of this period when I was doing more work myself overseas. I was kind of proud of the fact that I wasn't a missionary, because I was wrestling with that even then. That was late 20s into early 30s, and yet I was kind of. The religious publishing house I worked for had a foundation to help writers and editors in developing countries. I would go in and work directly with nationals. They would host me. I would be with them on the ground the whole time. For me, that was really healing in a way, because culturally, the person who was asking earlier about culture and Christianity, I had never really bonded the way I should have with people in Ethiopia, and I'm still embarrassed about that. And a lot of it had to do with the boarding school situation, because another aftershock was that if you're taken and put off in this fenced area with people who are from the West, then you aren't really getting to interact as much with your own peers in the country itself. So that's a dynamic that I'm still trying to kind of work through. But with the book, Comfort Trap, that came out of the years of working overseas, I was very prescriptive. I had a strong sense of what was right, what was wrong, and I wrote it in a mode that now I find a little hard to read, just to be honest. So it's not going to sell the book so well, I guess.
Sorry, how old were you when you wrote it? Like, you wrote it very
I was,
soon
that
after
would have been
you-
30 to 32, right around that age, something like that. Yeah. So I was a slower learner than you were. Yeah. Sure.
Do you find when you write that you ever have like this reconcile period between like your storyteller self, your writer self, and like the part of you that wants to be heard from your actual experiences, like the part of you that really just wants to tell
Get
who you
attention.
are and what you've been through? Yeah.
Marco Polo. Back again. Yeah. I think a lot of writing is therapeutic at its gut level, and that we start wanting to kind of heal ourselves, understand things, work through things. And for me, I don't know if I'm answering your question exactly, but as I write further into a project, I keep reaching for how would it be illuminating on a larger level for others in a more universal sense. And that's the storyteller in me that wants to be heard beyond just, hey, here I am, everybody look, isn't this great? I'm hoping that maybe my experience becomes a kind of lens that I'm not so critical to it, but you look through that lens at something larger that is in history, in culture, a specific time and place. What was happening there? And through looking through that lens, hopefully, there's discoveries that are bigger than me just telling you stuff that I feel compelled to get out there. Yeah, that's probably a good place to wrap up. Thank you for letting me come.